Welcome to Pratidhwani, where we try to humanize science. I'm your host, GV Pawan Kumar. It's my delight and pleasure to introduce you to my guest on this episode, Dr. Vipul Dutta. Vipul is an assistant professor at IIT Guwahati in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences. His research interests include South Asian diplomatic and military history and Indian business history. He holds a PhD from King's College London, specializing in diplomatic and economic history. And wonderful aspect of Vipul is his monograph, Making Officers Out of Gentlemen, which was published in 2021, which studies military institutions in colonial and post-colonial India. He also teaches modern Indian and business history, including an NPTEL course on Indian business history. And there's a lot more to explore about intellectual journey of Vipul, and I welcome you to Pratidhwani, Vipul. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Pawan, for this very interesting opportunity. And it's finally nice to see each other, even though it's online. And we've both been following each other's really interesting and fascinating work. So
Yeah.
it's so good to finally talk to you.
Thank you. My pleasure. My pleasure. I also actually came to know about Vipul when I attended the History Literature Festival, which happened in Pune in 2024. Fascinating session. In fact, I'll also be linking that video online, which into the show notes. But before we get into those specifics, Vipul, give us a gist of your origins. Where were you born? What was the kind of education you got, and other things?
Yeah. So I was born in Delhi, and then raised for the most part in Delhi as well. But my childhood was spread across the length and breadth of the country because I come from a military family. So I tagged along with my father wherever he went during the course of his service. But college onwards, I was in Delhi. So I picked up my undergraduate and postgraduate degrees in history from Delhi University. Later, I went to JNU for an MPhil. So these were the years, I think these were the formative years that shaped my research interests and also my academic interests before I embarked on a 4 year long doctoral degree in the UK. So I've divided my time between Delhi, UK, and now in Guwahati, where I've been working for the last 7 to 8 years.
Wonderful, wonderful. So, Vipul, what really kind of takes to make a historian, that too an academic historian? Generally we tend to hear a lot about so-called popular historians. Although for many of them, I do actually admire. They do a lot of interesting work. But there is also the people who really, kind of tackle the primary sources, go into archives, do hardcore research, and do a lot of interesting history and writing on history. Give us a gist about that aspect of what it really takes in the making of this whole kind of journey, and what are the specific aspects which are critical for somebody to take that particular route.
I think it requires a lot of patience to be an historian, I feel, because I spent about 7 years in Delhi completing my undergraduate, postgraduate, and MPhil degrees, which set the foundation for me to learn the essentials of the craft. So, as you rightly mentioned about primary sources, there isn't a degree course that allows you to gain the essentials of the archival practice or the archival method. For me, I was lucky enough to have been taught by a fabulous set of teachers at Delhi University and JNU who mentored me and my generation by taking us on visit to archives, helping us feel the material that's available in the archive, see how much time it takes to sift through the material that's available at an archive and try and see what useful material you can get for your projects and how to, more importantly, how to read that archival material in pursuit of your research. So it took about 3 to 4 years of rigorous academic apprenticeship for students like me to develop a love, respect for the rigors of archival research. So I would say, number one, patience is of the essence when you go about thinking of pursuing a career in history. And secondly, I think the quality of training is very important. So I was very fortunate to have been taught by teachers who have played such an important role in the development of my academic and research interests. In India, military history is still not a very attractive research area. It's still developing in terms of scope, capacity, and outreach. But in the UK, where I finished my doctoral degree, military history is an established discipline, both within the academic portals, but also it has a thriving popular history market where it relies on an ever-expanding bracket of readership that buys, reads, and discusses books pertaining to military history. So it's still developing in India, but I think regardless of wherever you are a student, what really matters in the development of your academic personality or your academic profile is your ability to be noticed by a mentor, or if you're lucky enough to have a mentor in your life. So early on during my undergraduate years and the postgraduate years at Delhi, I was extremely fortunate to have been spotted by fabulous teachers who identified my interest in military history and then encouraged it. And they by themselves were not military historians. So they taught us modern history or economic history, perhaps histories of imperialism, but they were magnanimous enough with their time in first having spotted my interest and then making available books, material, or networks that could have helped me chisel my research interests. So I think a lucky coming together of factors helped me develop my interest in history. And once those factors were in place, the training became a lot easier. So then as I embarked on my MPhil degree and I wrote a research project on the Second World War, for example, which laid the foundation for my doctoral research on the First and the Second World War, unwittingly helped me develop my craft. So being in constant touch with my professors, being in constant touch with my peer group as it started to expand after my postgraduate degree, helped set up a mechanism for the development of my craft as an historian. So in the absence of a formal professional degree in archival management or archival study, it's largely your peer group and your teachers who shape so much of your academic destiny.
Fabulous, fabulous. If one actually has to step back a little bit and also look at the formative years, especially when you are growing up and also getting exposed to various aspects of both social sciences and, of course, natural sciences, what is the junction at which you kind of decided that history would be a path you would take? Because it's not a very straightforward thing. Of course, even though even though if you are actually growing up in a military family, the first option would be to probably join the military itself, and there may be some other aspects and other aspirations too. But I'm always fascinated to understand this journey, what it actually is, the pathway you were actually thinking about, especially in the stage where you're yet to make strides in terms of the intellectual repertoire you get exposed to. Could you give us a gist of that?
Sure, sure. I think the journey towards becoming an historian was remarkable because that's not what I had set out to do initially. I was a science student. I was a science student in school, so just a regular physics, chemistry, mathematics, biology guy with a deep, deep interest to pursue medicine. And so I sat for medical entrance exams. I cracked a few, but the locations or the circumstances didn't really match my interest. And then suddenly I switched to history because I had always had an interest in the humanities and the languages while growing up. So it was a confluence of interests that had shaped my pre-collegiate days as a student. So I wasn't really sure if I wanted to take a year off and prepare for exams again to enter medicine. And I thought, instead of taking a year off, let me pursue studying another subject that I had a deep love for while growing up. So unfortunately, I'd done well in my +2 exams. So I got an entry into a really good college at Delhi University. And then the rest is history, as they say. So I didn't look back. It just one thing led to another. And I switched from one discipline to the other.
Oh, is
with
it?
a little bit of sadness, but with a lot of excitement as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, were there any specific sources, books, or any kind of any kind of exposition you got really interested by to incline your interest towards history, or was it something more kind of growth across your academic kind of exposure?
I think the interest got amplified over the course of the years,
Mm,
and my decision to pursue history in a more formal way got cemented once I entered my undergraduate degree in history.
mm,
Until then, I think my ideas were a little fuzzy. So I
mm,
was interested in pursuing a career in medicine. And then when I switched to the humanities, for the first 6 to 7 months, I still was a little unsure as to which pathway I wanted to take. So a lot of my friends who meet me today ask me, where is Vipul that I wanted to study medicine and what has he become now? So how did this change happen? And I find it hard to explain because it's difficult for me to put it down to words, but I've always somehow been led by what has really interested me at a
mm,
given moment. And at that moment, 10 to 12 years ago, I think I just wanted to give it a shot because I'd studied history, I'd loved it in school. And when I was given an opportunity to study it in Delhi in a great college with a great faculty, I thought, let me take this risk and we'll see
oh,
where it goes. So it was initially the first um, ballast, if you like,
mm,
for
mm.
pursuing history came from a personal decision to switch the
Switch.
stream.
Okay.
And so for me, it was a radical decision, actually, a break from the past. And it was a break on many fronts because there also, as you said, there was an expectation for me to have joined
Mm,
the
mm,
military, which was an ambition that I harbored because I wanted to enter the armed forces as a doctor.
mm, mm,
It's an ambition, it's a career goal that still fascinates me.
mm,
So maybe in the future I will take up questions of medical histories
mm,
or medical histories during warfare at a more advanced research level because it will help me go back to an earlier era where I was nursing a different ambition and mix it with the research training that I've received so far. But yeah, I mean, also I was lucky to not have parents who were overbearing, so they left
mm,
me to
mm.
do whatever I felt I was fit to do at the moment. So yeah, just a lot of happy set of factors and circumstances that allowed me to explore history and also gave me the time and space that I needed to develop a serious interest in the discipline. So I didn't want to pick up history only because I had nothing on hand.
Mm.
I did not want circumstances to pan out that way. From very early on, right from the first year of college, I was able to develop a very serious interest in history, mainly at that stage by the quality of teaching that was offered. So
Mm.
at the undergraduate level, I wasn't really sure of what kind of a research career I would want for myself. But really, the mentorship that I received or the quality of instruction that was received in college made all the difference. So it set the foundation for me to develop a respectable interest for the discipline.
Wonderful, wonderful. I want to also kind of, pick the point of having a conducive environment at your home where the encouragement still persists. Because there are so many people whom I also am aware of who would want to get into social sciences, specifically history or philosophy or other kind of topics, uh, uh, where the conditions actually are ripe and the interest is high, but the family doesn't look at it as an option.
Yeah,
So you did mention that you had a conducive environment.
yeah.
Were you also kind of aware of the fact that these are the options which you have that you could take, or was it just left to you that you make the choice? Because this is a very crucial decision to make, especially in Indian families, because because most of the conventional route is to either do engineering or medicine or look at the other facets. What's your thought about that?
Yeah. It's an interesting question, especially in the context of students who may want to transition from a professional course context
Yeah,
into the humanities,
yeah, yeah.
where things like placements or
Mm-hmm.
career progression or immediate career progression is a little difficult to articulate in the initial years. So when I joined college with the history honors program, the options were rather limited as they are even now. So one pathway is for you to take these subjects in the humanities with a view towards preparing yourself for public service exams. Or you could sit for a second postgraduate degree. You either go for an MBA or you take up further advanced studies in a given subject. So compared with a professional degree, employment opportunities may be limited, but that's also partly fueled by our unawareness of the scope of humanities degree. So apart
Very
from
well.
research, which hives away a good chunk of our students into higher degrees, there are also now developing fields today that make the humanities quite attractive. So for example, at IIT Guwahati here, we have run two MA flagship programs in development studies and liberal arts. And they are both interdisciplinary programs which offer grounding to students in a range of humanities and social sciences disciplines. And we try and give them a training which equips them for jobs in banking or in NGO or in public policy fora. Or we also let them pursue choices, whether it's higher academics or if they want to prepare for public service exams. But I think awareness is key as to what a humanities degree entails and what you want to do with it. So if you really have a budding, somewhat serious interest in research in the humanities, then I would recommend very seriously for you to consider studying the humanities.
Wonderful. So, yeah, it's such an important kind of information and also a viewpoint to obtain because the conventional courses, the professional courses are very vociferous, and of course there's a lot of money and also kind of ecosystem which is associated with it. But this is an equally important point what you mentioned about. So Vipul, I want to also kind of get a grasp of your kind of studies which you did, kind of gradually moving into your bachelor's, because you did mention that you also did an MPhil in related to World War. But before that, you would have also studied and probably got exposed to certain literature or certain archival sources, or it can be any kind of secondary source for that matter. Is there anything which really, really impressed upon you and also gave you an idea of the direction to go in this particular subtopic? And what was the kind of formative undergraduate training you got during that time?
Yeah. I think the undergraduate training was quite critical because it was a 3-year program. And in each of the years of the undergraduate degree, we were exposed to a range of subjects pertaining to history. So Indian history would be divided up between ancient, medieval, and modern. But each year would offer a more granular account of India's past. And these papers on Indian history were complemented with another set of papers pertaining to international histories. So we studied histories of North America, histories of Egypt, history of Central Asia, West Asia, as well as history of the erstwhile Soviet Union. And this was all brought together with another set of papers, which we back in the day used to call credit courses. So there would be an additional paper on economics. There would be a paper on languages. And the aim was really to offer holistic education with the core focus remaining on the discipline that you've chosen for yourself. So I earned an honors degree in history, but it was also complemented with these parallel streams that our teachers felt were essential for you to make full sense of what was being taught to you in the classroom. So I think that, first of all, laid the basis for me to appreciate or develop an appreciation for interdisciplinarity as far as history is concerned. So history, whether it's of India or America or Russia, was very early on taught to us as a discipline that could not be fully understood if you did not understand the political economy of the period, if you did not truly understand the context in which these past events were being taught to you, and a working knowledge of certain allied disciplines was deemed critical. So bits of sociology, a little more rigorous treatment of economics, plus a language immersion course that I experienced when I went for my MPhil degree in JNU, really set in motion some events that helped me develop an appreciation of how the discipline of history is both an intellectual enterprise, but it also has certain practical considerations, which really puts your mind in order before you even start to embark on a serious program of research. So developing appreciation for interdisciplinary elements that go into the making of a historical sensibility was one feature that I realized early on was essential for me to become a serious researcher.
Fabulous, fabulous. Because when one gets exposed to these kind of subtopics within let's say a discipline, you would also see the not only the depth but also the kind of connections of these topics to many other areas. In fact, one of the points I'm also very keen to learn about is the connection between the military history and the business history, which is something of your interest. It's such an important aspect, right? Because many of the as we talk, which is on 23rd of June, there are a lot of things which are happening in geopolitics which actually are kind of associated with both military and business history.
Yeah.
So during the formative years, did you also kind of develop interest in economics by any chance, or was it kind of developed later on? How did you go about?
So when I entered college, I did not really have a deep interest in economics, but because it was one of the subjects that was on offer, I uh, stumbled upon it, so to speak. And then later on developed an appreciation for it, which is again thanks to the teachers of that time, that the discipline really came out alive in the classroom. So that was one important factor that allowed me to develop an interest in the subject, which is really again goes back to the quality of teaching that was delivered at the time. But again, I revived my interest in business history only after I joined service here in Guwahati.
Oh, is it?
Because because I felt that so I teach business history here occasionally to the undergraduate students who are in the BTech program, and teaching them history has been, I think, singularly the most rewarding experience of my life so far.
Nice,
because it sort of brings together the discussions that we've had so far on professional courses and what the humanities can offer into a beautiful amalgam. Because the IITs, I mean, were set up with a view towards offering holistic education to STEM undergrads. And the HSS electives is written into their course curriculum. So teaching them has been quite rewarding because for them, the HSS electives can mean a variety of things. For many, it offers a refreshing change from their regular curriculum in the sciences and mathematics. So a lot of them look forward to our lectures in history or literature or economics because it's so different from what they've been studying since 8 a.m.
Absolutely.
on a weekly basis. So an HSS elective later in the day is I think, a beautiful incentive for them to revive their interest in academics. And secondly, for me, I felt offering business history would be a good opportunity because it was seen to be a good fit between what BTech students were studying here and what a lot of them were aspiring to do in the future. So a lot of undergraduates, whether at IIT or even at other regular central universities, have been moving to business schools where they go for an MBA, but also later they may want to pursue PhDs in economics or in management-related fields. And I feel if you offer a course on business history at the undergrad level, it sort of prepares them for what they're going to be facing in the future. So that was the immediate reason for me to start taking a deeper interest in business history. And then the other reason was my own personal interest. So I've always been interested in pursuing the connections that bring geopolitical events closer to the economic turns that our century has been taking for quite some time now. So it is this need to study economics, politics from a closer angle and how they inform military events of the past century or so that allowed me to jump into it. So that's what I did.
Wonderful, wonderful. So specifically your research questions and agenda during your undergraduate, down to even the MPhil degree. You did mention about the World War. What were the questions you were interested in? Could you just give us a gist?
Sure. So my foray into research began really when I enrolled for the MPhil program at JNU. And of course, the MPhil program no longer exists today. But back in the day, it was often considered to be a program where you could test the waters and see if you were cut out for a research career or not. And those 2 years were fundamental for my training as a researcher because it allowed me to cast a wider net as far as potential research topics was concerned. And so I began the MPhil program with the research project mainly focused during the years of the Second World War. So I was looking at questions of partition and their impact on the Indian armed forces. What were the factors that caused the division of forces between India and Pakistan in the years leading up to 1947? But I was also looking at how the roles of how colonialism and imperialism affected the state of the Indian armed forces, and how did India go about assessing, absorbing, and implementing the lessons it learned from this very difficult decade from the 1930s to 1940s. And the focus largely was on division of men, materials, and capacities in the run-up to partition, and how the Second World War affected this exercise. So I was looking at the impact of Second World War on the training of the Indian Army. I was looking at how the Second World War also hastened the departure of the British from the Indian subcontinent, and what was its precise impact on military institutions in the Indian subcontinent. And I used this question, I chiseled it further for my PhD project, where the focus then became largely on studying how these military institutions had started to come up in the Indian subcontinent. So today we tend to think of the National Defense Academy, for example, which is in Pune, or the IMA, as iconic military institutions, which they are. But with my research, I wanted to see what were the earliest stirrings of institution building in the subcontinent, and what was happening before these iconic academies came into place. So for my PhD, I really zoomed in and owned the questions that I started to experiment with in my MPhil days. So PhD offered a more detailed account of the emergence of these institutions in India. How did war affect the training of officers, mainly officers in India? And what were the management, administrative, and intellectual challenges associated with the development of these academies, feeder schools, and how did India go about establishing a self-reliant military institutional framework for the country from the pre-colonial times down to the 1960s. So I ended my research in the 1960s.
60, yeah. Because probably we'll come to also the book in a short while. But I would want to also know what was your process of kind of gathering the sources, because that is very crucial. Because if you're many of the people, especially in the STM, would be interested to know the pathway of actually finding primary sources, because the notion of garnering evidence in sciences, natural sciences, is actually a very different concept and also a different viewpoint. But historians really have to go very, very specific and deep into sources, and also metaphorically make the differentiation between the wheat and the chaff, so to speak. Could you please tell us that both from your own experience and also a broader perspective?
So I think studying in Delhi, I was lucky to be exposed to 2 or 3 iconic archival institutions, which are largely the first ports of call for any historians working on Indian history. So I started my research project by scanning the material or viewing the material that was available at the National Archives of India, which is based in Delhi, and also the institution which is now known as the Prime Minister's Memorial Library, which also is a repository of a substantial record of India's past. It also has a fabulous library. So being in Delhi gave us really easy access to these fabulous institutions that really become your best friends as you go about writing your research history projects. But increasingly, and this is a positive development in India, a lot of state archives across the north, east, west, and south are now also witnessing a renewed interest or are witnessing a renewed footfall of historians within their portals. So a lot of state archives offer hitherto unexplored material in local languages, for example, that opens up so many possibilities for us to write newer kinds of histories. And also, importantly, a lot of the material that is now available at these archives is now available online.
Yes.
through
Yeah.
digital
Digital. Yeah.
catalogs. And Professor Chinmay Tunga has done he's rendered signal service to
Yeah.
documenting these archives and telling us where to go, look for a particular file, or look for new records that could completely revolutionize our understanding of India's past. So hats off to him for his work. And I think this really opens a new chapter in pursuing histories, but also newer kinds of histories, which can be written with access to a lot of different material. So for the longest time, the complaint that one had been hearing in history circles in India was that the books and the material that you publish as outputs of historical research were largely based on English language sources, or were largely based on sources that we've inherited from the colonial government that left India in 1947. How does one write histories that are more attuned to the realities or lived experiences of the majority of the people who lived in the subcontinent, who may or may not have had active links to the colonial government? So since the 1980s, there has been a churn in the manner in which newer kinds of Indian histories have emerged. So there has been a shift away from writing histories that were purely considered to be viewpoints of particular institutions or people, towards writing histories of communities, histories of women, histories of gender, or certain other groups who felt they have been marginalized, mainly by writing histories that were dependent on particular kinds of sources.
Nice.
So there has been a churning in the discipline where we are now looking for sources that are no longer just government records, that are no longer just records of correspondences between, let's say, the commander-in-chief or the viceroy, or records of correspondence between elite leaders of important political outfits. We're now looking for sources that tell us about the cultural practices of communities who have never been documented historically, or looking at experiences of women or experiences of different communities who have not been mainstreamed by the predominant trend that existed in Indian history. So that has led the historians, the vast majority of historians in India and abroad, those who are working on Indian history, to look for new sources which tell us a different story, which is not really connected with elitist networks or narratives of power, but tell us about the realities and lived experiences or cultural or social aspects of people who have so far just remained a statistic in historical analysis. So a new radical churning in the historical discipline has largely been made possible by the discovery and study of non-English sources.
Yeah. It's such an important aspect for Indian situation, right? Because the information what is really being put out as conventional knowledge is of course limited to whatever it was available in the language which is applicable. And given that the country is so vast, there will surely be a lot more interesting histories to be told. So, what is your general process, Vipul? Of course, we'll come to the book within a couple of minutes, but I also wanted to know, was there a difference between your process while you were starting? And of course, once you mature, you'll also change your methods a little bit. That is one thing I'm really keen to also learn about your research methods, because I should also mention that Chinmay also has been on this Pratidwani in the past. And he also described his methods and other things, because this is a new information in a sense for our audience, because a lot of people do get exposed to scientists per se, but historians also are very important kind of hunters of information, facts, and also interpretation. Therefore, our methods actually overlap in a very interesting way. And if one looks at his intellectual history of scientists, there is also kind of lineage of ideas which come into picture, which is very similar to, let's say, historians really trying to come up with evidences, etc. So, tell us a little bit about your methods.
So my method is primarily archival. So I tend to go looking for a verifiable record for a project that I'm interested in. So my method is largely extensively archival. So the first step really that I undertake for any research project, whether it's for the book or any research project that I've undertaken in the past, is to go looking for a really wide survey of the material that can be accessed for my work. And that survey includes primary sources, which is not just material that you get at an archive, but also primary sources like autobiographies or biographies of people who existed at the time when you want, at a
yeah.
time which you want to study for yourself. So an extensive preliminary survey of the material that's available locally at an archive is the first step before I set out to embark on a research project. And then I devote at least 1 to 2 months cataloging the material that's available. So that would entail repeated visits to an archive, combing through the catalog that's available. So if I'm interested, let's say, for example, writing a history of the First World War, I would ideally be interested not just in looking at the military records of the event. So I would go looking for the military files of the military department of the then government of India. But I would also be parallelly looking at records of the economic department. I would also be looking at trade figures. I would be looking at recruitment numbers, because the aim really is to write a holistic story of what took place in the past. And for that overarching narrative to function smoothly and to appear logical, I think a variety of sources are needed. So my first principle in research is largely to corroborate the findings that you discover for yourself at an archive. So if it's an interesting letter that you've chanced upon that either confirms or disproves your theory, I ideally like to supplement it or corroborate it with an analysis of different types of material that we have currently available. So I would be looking at an autobiography to see if what is being conveyed in the letter matches the spirit of what I'm reading in a different document. Then the third corroboration would happen by doing a close analysis of historical records of newspapers. So this triangulation, for example, of one given fact that you may discover at an archive needs to be checked by comparative analysis with what you may find in other sources. And your question is really interesting because because I teach a methods course here, which is a compulsory MA course on historical methods within our liberal arts postgraduate program. And I give the students, because it's a semester system, so you have to compress a lot of knowledge within the span of 4 months. So we begin with a historical analysis of how the discipline of history came to evolve, how it was set up professionally in Europe, and how the march of colonialism introduced the modern discipline of history to India as well, and how the British perceived history should be taught to people. And we often spend some time discussing some of the analytical debates that had taken place in Britain, in Germany, and France on the true nature of the discipline of history, whether it's a science, is it a social science, or should we club history with the humanities? And we've had some really interesting set of discussions on those topics where historians like E.H. Carr and several other public intellectuals in England, France, Germany, really spent a lot of time debating as to what the true nature of history was. Is it a science or is it a social science? Can history really recreate conditions of the past, or is it an interpretive exercise? So, I mean, there are no easy answers to it, because in history, all historians can do is assemble facts and offer a perspective. We can't really recreate conditions like it can be done in a laboratory. So, but methodology and the rigor that you employ for your research really is quite subjective. And I think it differs from individual to individual, which again is fascinating because it contributes to the multiplicity of narratives that hover around, have hovered around in the past and continue to hover to this day. But certain principles, I think, are essential to maintain the integrity of the project.
Wonderful. So we'll come to the book. In fact, that is something which I would want to also spend a little time on. The title of the book is Making Officers Out of Gentlemen, Military Institution Building in India from period 1900 to 1960. This was published in 2021 from Oxford University Press. So tell us about the making of the book, Vipul. How did it go about? Because I also, I have an e-copy of the book. I actually had a look at it, and it looks very fascinating. I went through a few of the chapters too, and it's an exhaustive research project which has been also converted into a book. It is very evident if one sees it. Tell us a little bit about the book.
So it was again a fascinating journey from developing and crystallizing my research ideas and then finally seeing it published in the form of a book. But the interest was largely in fundamental questions of what's
mm,
the precise impact of conflict and warfare
mm,
in the early 20th century was on the Indian subcontinent. So the main idea behind writing this book was to tell a larger and more complicated story of institution building in India. Because from 1900s to 1960s, a block of about 6 decades, which
mm,
witnessed a momentous phase of institution building, not just in the military, but across different sectors. First in the pre-colonial context, and then after
mm,
47, you have the post-independence context. So I tried to tell an institutional history of India pertaining to
mm,
the military context, but not divorcing it from the larger institutionalization of the country that took place in these 6 decades. And of course, when we talk about institutionalization, at least in history, our discussions tend to get veered away into the 1947 moment
yeah.
where partition and independence happens. And then there's a break, and then we chart the history of contemporary India after 47. But I wanted to use my research to drive home an important point, which was to see these institution building exercises as cyclical,
Mm,
and how the earliest infrastructure that came up in the early part of the 20th century led to successive waves of institution building. So the idea behind research was both evidence-based, analytical, but also was driven by the need to change the perception on what
mm,
constitutes institutionalized change in the Indian armed forces in these last 6 decades. And of course, this research was foregrounded by a thoroughgoing examination of the First World War and the Second World War.
mm,
And the First World War is important because it was after the conclusion of the First World War that Indian men were first deemed eligible to
mm,
gain a
mm.
commission as officers in the
Yes.
Indian Army. Until then, they held a commission which was considered to be inferior to the
Mm,
King's Commission. So their nature of responsibilities, their remuneration, and their ceremonial standing was considered inferior to the white officers who were stationed in India. But that
mm,
changes after 1990. And I try to argue that this is not just a military event triggered by the events of the First World War, but this also has to be seen in a political context where representation of Indians in every branch of government was largely a political demand that was being driven by these ambitious men who had come together to
mm,
devise or forge a new vision for the country. So the articulation of an anti-colonial sensibility, which we often today in schools and colleges teach largely in the context of the national movement, also
mm,
has to be studied in relation to its other multifarious consequences that it had for other branches of the government or for other professions. So that was the guiding spirit for the book. And then, of course, events that started in the First World War gained increasing momentum with the Second World War. And
mm.
both these wars are important for our history because India supplied the largest number of troops,
Troops.
largest concentration of troops for these two world wars. So Britain had not, I mean, had Britain did not have, had Britain not had India by its side,
Mm.
uh, the war effort would really have been collapsed,
Collapse.
would have collapsed in no time. So it was largely Indian troops, Indian money, and Indian material that made British victory in First World War and Second World War possible against the Germans. And so I use these two really momentous events to try and see what their localized impact for India was
Mm,
in terms of not just recruitment, but also what it did for our ability to set up these iconic academies and to develop a cluster of different interconnected institutions in how they started to train or make the career of officership an aspiration for different men in the country. So that was the central idea.
wonderful. Uh, is this particular aspect of contribution also kind of, appreciated among European historians? Of course, I assume the general public in Europe is not aware of this major
Mm.
contribution from
Yeah.
Indians in World War. Uh, has the thought process changed? Why I say this is because there's an interesting connection. Within the framework of history of science, there is a slow churning which is happening where the Eurocentric aspect, because science has this very strong kind of bound towards this revolution in terms of scientific thinking, as though it has originated only from a particular place. Of
Right.
course, scientific way of thinking is not something confined to one geography.
True.
But in this particular case, because it's a mixture of social and political and military history, has there been an appreciation of these contributions, especially given the fact that European historians do pay a lot of attention to World War?
Mm,
Has there been a realization, because
mm,
the foot on the ground,
mm,
especially in that era, probably would have been much more important than even
mm,
what it is in the era
mm.
of drone and etc.
Yeah,
Means you'd probably have a better idea of this, but I'm just curious to know about this.
yeah. It's interesting. I think I would say there are events which trigger sparks of consciousness.
Mm, mm,
So, for example, 2014, when Britain was commemorating the centenary of the
mm, mm,
beginning of the First World War,
mm,
uh, I was in England
mm,
in the middle of my doctoral studies. So it
mm,
was a fascinating time to be in England to watch all these
mm,
commemorations happening
no, mm,
across the country. And so the Indian question was then raised, uh, partly because I was conducting a research project in those times. So the attention was focused on
yeah.
me and
Mhm,
other friends of mine who were also engaged in similar uh, projects. But also, 2014 is also the year when I think increasingly commemoration efforts in India became very popular.
mm,
So from since 2014, I think there's now an annual commemoration
mm,
which offers tribute to the fallen soldiers of the First World War. So that marked a watershed as far as public memory is concerned. It stoked
nice.
a new public inquiry into questions of Indian involvement in the First World War. So I would say the centenary was one event that triggered a round of public, calm academic engagement with the Indian question. It
Mm,
wasn't as if there was no engagement with it. So monuments exist in the battlefields of Europe, which were erected to commemorate the valor and sacrifice of Indian troops. And of course, there are families whose descendants in India still commemorate
mm.
the sacrifice of their ancestors who fought in the First World War. In fact, I have one of my PhD students currently is looking at the contributions of Garhwali
Nice,
in the
nice. Yeah.
First World War. So he's had the chance to meet descendants of those men who fought in the First World War, many of whom were decorated with gallantry awards like
Mm,
Victoria Crosses and other such gallantry awards. So I think repeated engagements with a past question carries the seeds for a revival of
mm.
interest in that subject. So history as a subject is never dead. It just remains for a handful of people to revive interest in it.
Revive it. Yeah.
And a revival for these topics really depends on these events. So many historians today discount the value of events in history. They say that one single event should not be overemphasized
Emphasize. Yeah. Yeah.
for its potency in changing the historical narrative. I tend to disagree with them because I feel events sometimes can be so important that they
Mm.
can trigger something larger
Gotcha.
than the immediacy of that event. And I feel the 2014 movement was quite cathartic because it allowed some people to renew their association with something that
Mm.
had already taken place in the past. It wasn't as if people were inventing new stories about the past. India did supply and lose so many of its soldiers in those iconic battles that allowed Britain to proclaim victory. So, 100 years later, after the war, even if two people get up and look up the history of our country in that conflict or the enormous sacrifices that were made, um, it would be a victory for history, I feel.
Mm. Yeah, such an important aspect, because uh, that's probably the reason why history is also so important, right?
Yeah,
Because it is a kind of an a recapturing of memory to a large extent, as much as possible in an authentic way,
true.
with also very new interpretations. Because also there's a lesson to learn from
Yeah,
all these aspects.
yeah.
So yeah, it's very fascinating. So, Vipul, tell us a little bit about your writing process, the mechanics of it, because that is also, as an intellectual, and also people who would be willing to really understand the historian writing, because that is something which differs from person to person,
Yeah.
and your own ways and kind of methods would be very interesting to learn. Yeah,
Yeah. I think all that I know about writing and its
Mm.
discipline is something that I've absorbed from the teachers I've
Yeah,
met.
yeah, yeah,
So,
yeah.
In fact, my own supervisor, Professor Srinath Raghavan, a noted scholar on military history and modern history, has provided a template for me to emulate in how to go about writing and the discipline surrounding it. So
he has been prolific, right? He's a very prolific author.
Yeah. For me, he's been a role model. So I tend to use his example to try and motivate me to write as much as I can. But the method for me, I mean, writing for me is I don't have a method for it. It's just that once the cataloging process for me is complete, once the archival material is within my grasp, and once I've had, once I've completed a broad survey of the existing literature on the subject, there's nothing to be done except to just sit down and just completely seal yourself off from all the distractions that are available and just hammer down at least 5,000 to 8,000 words. If not daily, then at least in a week. But you and I both are academics in India. We know how difficult it is. Writing exercises are punctuated with so much other essential stuff that needs to be executed on so many fronts that it's difficult. But I do remember one advice that was given to me by a professor of mine in London, Dr. Janvi Falke, who's now the director of the Science Gallery in Bangalore.
Fabulous.
And I think it must have been one of those sad days where I must have been whining about there's so much to be read, there's so much to be written down. How am I ever going to finish all of this? And she sat me down and he said, Vipul, just stop thinking and stop talking about how much that needs to be done and just go to your room and write. And write 100 words, write 10 words or 15 words, but just transform the energy that is being spent on thinking about writing into actually start typing into the keyboard so that what you've been thinking starts becoming more practical. And it's something that I use to motivate myself. And it's a piece of wisdom that I impart to my PhD students now, that stop thinking about whether you want to write a perfect research proposal or the book that you're writing is going to win awards. Stop thinking about it. Stop even thinking whether this annual progress seminar that you're going to do is going to be received with rave reviews by doctoral committees. That's not your concern. Just finish and write. Just write and finish, rather. Because a completed research project is the only thing that's expected of you. It's true for a student. It's true for academics. So Janvi drilled it into me, and I now pass it on to my students.
Nice. Very, very, very nice. So we'll broaden the scope a little bit in terms of the discussion and get your views slightly more on a broader context of the history writing itself. Because in India, there's a very popular genre of people reading history slightly from a broader perspective. Because it's become very interestingly an important part of the discourse. I wish science was gaining similar kind of traction, but nevertheless, I'm happy that people at least are engaging in history, even though it actually is from a viewpoint which may differ from each other, but there is still some discourse which is happening. And on the other hand, I also see scholars like you and Srinath, Janvi, and so many others who are anchored in academic environments or slightly connected academic environments who also do very interesting work. And there are so many people across India. Somehow they probably would not gain the same prominence in terms of the exposure to the public. Of course, their work is very well known. And thanks to Chinmay, there's a lot of interesting things. The History Literature Festival really brought to foray this kind of a fantastic kind of exposure to very good, authentic people. But what is your thought, Vipul? Where is it heading towards? Because on one hand, as I mentioned, history actually is very, very central to a lot of discourse in India today. But on the other hand, it needs also a little bit more kind of projection from an academic viewpoint.
Yeah. So I think public history or popular history, as it's being projected in the media or on social media or popularly by people who write these books, I welcome it. I mean, I love reading those books. So I have no disdain for it. In fact, I've just finished reading Manu Pillai's latest on,
Guns,
yeah,
Guns, Godson. Yeah.
yes, yes.
Yeah.
So a fabulous account, and I've read all
Yeah.
his prior work on history of Kerala and
Mm,
other things that he's produced, and I think it's fabulous. I mean, I love to read anyway. So
mm,
before I knew I wanted to study history, before I knew I wanted to be a doctor, I knew that I love to read. So I
mm,
think
mm.
that laid the foundation for me to develop an engagement which is likely to be a lifelong engagement with the humanities because I loved reading the printed word.
Painted.
It
Yeah.
didn't matter whether it came from a professional historian or public historian.
Yeah.
For
Yeah.
that matter, I love reading Charles Dickens and
Mm,
the Bronte sisters. So I think a love for reading is essential if you want to
mm.
survive in humanities and academia. Otherwise, I mean, why
It
would you
will.
want to bore yourself in this profession if you don't like to read? So I welcome it, and it's such a breath of fresh air when people like Manu Pillai or even Narayani Basu, for example,
Basu. Yeah. Yeah.
who's been writing fabulous books on diplomatic history. In fact, her book on
History.
K.M. Panikar is just out,
Yes.
which I
Yes. Yes.
use
Yeah.
for my diplomacy lectures.
Nice.
So, a
Nice.
biography of K.M. Panikar, it's deeply original work,
Mm,
written in accessible language. So, it's best of both the worlds. What more could you want? And the other issue about formal historical research is that it could do with some work on
mm,
accessibility. So for
mm.
us, because both of us are academics in the formal
Yeah.
university network, we know peer-reviewed articles still are the cornerstone for career progression.
Pretty. Yeah.
Unless you're recognized by your peers, it will not establish your reputation on a more solid, concrete basis, nor will it allow you to progress further in your career, nor will it allow you to forge networks in higher academia. So, but then the question people pose to that trend is, well, how many people read journal articles anyway? And
Yeah.
how affordable is it for a schoolboy or for an average college person in a tier 2, tier 3 city to download a journal article, which his college does not have access to, and read it? So, and in fact, I remember one of your podcasts in which you put it very elegantly, where you said that latest research in academia or in the sciences is like a needle that peers through the
PS. Yeah.
fog.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Exactly.
and
It
offers
has to
us,
really cut
yeah,
through right away.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
at the
That's a really
cutting
good
edge.
way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes,
It's a
you put
cutting
it
edge.
beautifully. I've mangled it, so you'll correct me how you put it. But
No. It's on the on similar lines. Yeah.
you said it
Exactly.
beautifully that
Uh,
research in journals or
yeah.
something
Yeah.
that's recently published offers us the latest view of how the field exists at that very
Exists. Yeah.
moment.
Yeah.
Whereas books will give you a more synoptic picture of what exists in the field in a more broad-based manner
Broad base.
without
Yeah.
the pressing urgency of offering you detail. So I think we need both. History as an academic discipline can survive for the longest time because people need degrees.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
need an undergraduate degree to study for a higher degree. But for the general public to develop an interest in our heritage, in our culture, which is so rich with the layers of past that make up India today, that some form of public engagement is
Engagement.
extremely essential.
Engagement.
So the ideal situation would be university-based academics making a case for public impact for their research. And I mean, I'm proud to see the work of my professors like Jahnavi, who's a
Mm.
historian of science and is now
Science.
at the
Yeah. Yeah.
cutting edge of a public engagement with the sciences.
Absolutely.
Similarly,
Absolutely.
with Srinath, who's been
Yeah.
teaching at universities, but also has worked with think tanks. Then there's another professor, Dr. Rudra Chaudhary,
Mm.
who's the director for Carnegie India, and who's done, I mean, he's trained historian, has done fabulous work on diplomatic history, military history, and today leads a team of bright individuals in
Mm.
Delhi, where he leads the Carnegie India
Nice.
policy
Nice.
body, which is
Okay.
at the cutting edge of research, both
Mm.
historical and public policy. But he's also engaging with a diverse range of stakeholders within India and abroad. So for me, I have examples of three bright historians working within the domain of formal academic research, but also not forgetting what the public policy impact of their craft has been.
Right.
So, I
Absolutely.
mean, I have been in a great position to see the work of these individuals. And it's such a
Absolutely.
great time to be a historian, I feel.
Fabulous, because it also reminds me, for example, Professor Venkatachalpati down
Yes.
who is again an academic, but my word, he's also very
Yeah.
prolific and
Yeah.
such a very thoughtful cultural history
Absolutely.
viewpoints are so fabulous. Chandan Gowda is another person
Yeah.
also
Yeah.
there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, So, Vipul, give us a gist of the kind of questions you are now looking into. What are the kind of problems you are now, problems, rather, problem is the word generally we use in science, but maybe in the context of
Yeah.
history, maybe the areas and specific kind of timelines and other things, what you are now looking into.
Yeah. So far, my interest has largely remained within the confines of the early 20th century. But of late, I've been thinking of moving further back
Mhm.
to see how India's early military engagements in the 19th century
Mm.
had any impact on its later engagements um, during and after the First and the Second World Wars. So, I mean, research is still at a very preliminary stage, but I'm hoping to uncover episodes of India's engagements
Mm.
in Africa, for instance, or
Nice.
in China, to see how those early colonial encounters within a military context set the stage for a more internationalized account of India's military history. So that is one. And the other is, and I can't really quantify as research because uh, I have a cluster of 5 to 6 PhD students working under my
Mm.
supervision now,
Mm.
all of them largely related in diplomatic history and military history.
Need to see.
So it's through editing
I
their
see that you're
drafts.
also working something related to Nepal and Bhutan, right? That is, I just saw in one of the places where that is a area which you are interested in.
That's
I
one of my
think
PhD students,
PhD
actually.
students, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
So
yeah,
he's
nice,
he's finishing his PhD thesis on India's aid diplomacy with Nepal and Bhutan.
wonderful.
So I'm learning a lot through their work,
Mm,
in
mm,
fact. And this is one of the other rewarding things about teaching, is that if you manage to get a good cluster of students under your supervision, I mean, the sky is the limit. And the amount of
absolutely.
work that they're doing and the fascinating stories they uncover through their own local archival visits, whether it's in Bhutan, Nepal, or in Kumaon, or in Manipur, which is another student of mine who's looking at
Mm,
the early colonial history of Manipur. It's just fascinating at the level, quality, and the amount of new knowledge that's being generated. So I feel not a small amount of pleasure in being a part of their academic journeys. So more than my own research, I feel humbled, I would say, in being able to help students both within PhD as well as MA,
yeah,
where I'm able to play a small part in helping them define what they want to do. So yeah, those are the
wonderful.
two
Well,
things.
so y- your experience in teaching humanities in IITs, how has it been overall? Of course, you get a lot of students who have varied interests, and
Yeah,
being in a technology school also has its own
yeah.
kind of interesting
It's excellent
things.
so far, and
Mhm.
luckily, I like teaching.
Mhm.
So it's been a great journey because undergraduate classes can range from 80 to 150 students,
Mhm.
anything between that.
Yeah.
And this is the undergraduate classes I'm talking
Mm.
about. So, and we have weekly lectures. So I like it. I mean, I like engaging with them. And there have been occasions where students have switched after their BTech program
Wow.
to exploring options in the humanities. So I know of 2 or 3 cases where students have been so fascinated with what's been taught to them in the classroom that they've switched to an MA degree or an MSc degree,
Mm.
or they go abroad for a more
Mm.
sustained, rigorous course in the humanities, and they go on to become historians. So I see that as the high point
I
of my
absolutely,
contribution, where you've been able to
absolutely.
convince a STEM undergrad to see the beauty of research in another discipline. But even if they were to continue in their engineering disciplines, it's nice to be able to talk to them about these things because, in the absence of confirmed, verified scholarship, uh, there's only a mobile device that offers you context for daily
Absolutely.
news. So
Mm.
whenever I start my undergrad course, whether it's military history, which I will teach in the next semester, or
Mm.
whether
Mm.
it's business history, I often tell students that in addition to the material that I'm supplying for this course, please do not forget to read the newspaper daily,
Wonderful. Wonderful.
because
Yes.
and it's so counterintuitive because they get flummoxed as to why a history professor is
Mm.
telling us to read the newspaper which is about current events, and I tell them the more detailed your analysis of the daily
Mm.
news, the higher your surprise at finding out how events of today are so intimately connected with what
Connected.
I'm
Connected.
just about to tell you. So even if it's First World War, talking about the creation of the Middle East or West Asia
Mm. Mm.
and what the imperial powers did to those countries, And when you flip the newspaper open this morning, you'll find out news about the Iran-Israel conflict
Yes, yeah.
or the involvement of Americans in the Middle East or whatever. And the only takeaway from this daily reading of the newspaper is the realization that things are so intimately connected that the legacies of historical events that took place 100 years ago or even 200 years ago are still present with us. So
Absolutely.
teaching undergraduate students has been quite exciting for me. In the manner I've been able to convey historical information to them, and also they keep us on our toes because
Absolutely.
STEM undergrads are not socialized into a humanities degree. So the questions they ask are so essential for our teaching practice as well. Because unlike MA students or PhD students who have a degree or two in humanities behind them, the STEM undergrads have come straight from school. And so many of them have come here after having clocked years and years of training, possibly at a coaching institute or at a school where the ultimate ambition was to get into IIT, which is great because they're all hard workers. But the quality of questions they ask not only testifies to their own original thinking, but also helps us develop our teaching craft. Because then how do you respond to that student? And how do you break down a past event into elementary subparts so that the story can be conveyed as logically to them as possible. Because logic works with STEM undergrads more profoundly than it possibly would in other contexts. So a clear clinical examination of past events and the ability of students to grasp it has been, it's quite magical. So I've enjoyed it.
Fabulous, fabulous. That's actually one of the rewards of teaching because it is both immediate and also long term. It's a very counterintuitive thing, right? Because it of course affects not only the learner but also the person who is supposed to teach also ends up learning a lot during this particular process.
True.
That's something which is very fascinating about teaching itself. So, Vipul, as we come towards the conclusion, give us a gist of your questions, contemporary questions, what you're looking at, and kind of future plans, what you have.
Yeah. Future plans largely on seeing how far I can take military history in the public domain, how to develop a context in which people might be interested in India's past, whether military past or economic past, in more exciting ways. So I think this podcast is a nice beginning for that engagement. So thank you again for this invitation.
My pleasure. Absolutely. Yeah.
So that is one question that I've been dealing with and it's become an urgent question because of what you pointed out earlier. What is the place of popular history in mainstream academic discourse? What can it do for a more public engagement with our past? And what is its position vis-a-vis formal outputs of academic research? And should they act in combination with each other? So my aim largely going forward would be to try and see if my historical research can make a public impact in any one way or the other, either in making a section of people interested in questions of India's past, or by making interventions in policy practices by the findings of my own research. So I'm interested in seeing how questions of military institutionalization develop in India further. How far can institutions of professional learning in India be set up? So military academies in India, or what can be done to administratively or intellectually create a context in which professional military learning can be made easier, can be facilitated for more clearer research outcomes, is a question that I'm engaged with.
Okay. All the best for all the ventures what you take up, and there's something very fascinating about learning a lot more beyond conventional aspects what we get exposed. For example, every time I do read historians and philosophers, because there's also a deep connection to sciences in other forms, and these are ingrained to the humanities because they are part of human nature, right? It's actually inherent to how we think. That appreciation actually has to be always there, that there is much more to it than just conventional boundaries which we define as disciplines. And,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Also, I just want to quickly add in about how valuable teaching as a service is, not just for
Absolutely.
sciences, but also humanities. I mean, I
Absolutely.
would not be in studying history if it was not for one name that I forgot to mention earlier, which is Professor Mahesh Rangarajan, who
Oh,
taught me
yes, yes.
modern history at Delhi University, and later he was director of the Nehru Memorial Library, which is the
Memorial.
Prime
Yeah.
Minister's Memorial Library.
Yeah.
And I was at a time when I was thinking whether I should stick to history or take up international relations at a different university. And one of my friends said, no, you should continue with history. Think of this
Mm.
new elective that is being offered by a professor here. And none of us knew who he was. But he came in and we studied. And at the time, we used to have 2 hour lectures in Delhi University without a break. And those 2 hour lectures were transformed by the magical oratory, knowledge, and dedication of people like Professor Mahesh Rangarajan. So
Yep.
he would split the class. 1 hour would be in English, the other would be in Hindi, which he would conduct
Wow.
himself. And that really instilled in me a deep love and respect for teaching and how far
Mm.
it can take you in your discipline. So, more than research, which is an outcome of good teaching, I feel, it's the teachers who have built
Oh,
up
make me.
this profession. So, I mean, I salute them.
Wonderful. That is a great note to, conclude
Yeah.
the podcast. Vipul, thank you very much for this wonderful kind of insight, conversation. There's a lot more to learn, and I would strongly urge people to also have a look at the references, where I'll also put the links into the book and also the webpage of Professor Vipul Datta. You would also get a lot more if you can read and also, engage with a lot of interesting stuff what he has written, and I thank him for this wonderful conversation, Vipul. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
Thanks to you. It was wonderful chatting with you. Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
This is Pratidwani, where we try to humanize science, this time with the one and the only Professor Vipul Datta. Thank you, Vipul.
Thank you.